No rolling, only thunder. It's Segaiden episode 92.
Ah, there's that wit. I love it.
They say thunder and they say lightning, it will never strike twice. But they're damn liars, as the name on this game's box proves. Though in fairness, Thunder Force 2 showed up on Sega Genesis without any precedent. Where was Thunder Force 1, you may ask? And well, you might. Thunder Force 1 never came to the US, because it only ever appeared on computers that were, to my knowledge, never formally sold in the States. The lead computer, the Sharp X1, is one of the coolest computers ever made. I mean, maybe not in terms of power, which put it somewhere in the neighborhood of an MSX2, but in terms of looks, I mean, just check out that gorgeous red case. Beautiful. Sharp positioned the X1 as a direct competitor to the MSX, in fact, and I suppose that would make developer Technosoft the Sharp equivalent to Compile. Like Compile, Technosoft mostly created shooters, but also dabbled in other genres, and sometimes they smushed together shooter elements with concepts from other ways of gaming life. Compile had action RPG shooter hybrids like Golvelius and the Guardian Legend, and Technosoft would give us Herzog Zwei, which may not have been the first real-time strategy game in history, but could certainly make a strong case for that claim. A shooter with territory acquisition and resources. But Herzog Zwei is still a ways away on Segaiden, and we don't get to Herzog Zwei without Thunder Force 2. And we don't get to Thunder Force 2 without Thunder Force. That X1 shooter, which also appeared on the similarly Japan-exclusive PC-88, almost feels like designer Kotori Yoshimura played Raid on Bungling Bay and said, "Wow, that's so cool that I need to steal that idea for myself." Except that, oh dear, the original Commodore 64 version of Bungling Bay made its debut in December 1984, a full year after Thunder Force first appeared on Sharp X1 in December 83. So I suppose a better frame of reference would be that Yoshimura played Namco's cult arcade classic Bosconian and said, "Wow, that is so cool that I need to steal that idea for myself and also give it the scenery and combination air-to-air, air-to-ground combat of Xevious." And that is precisely what she did, as you'd expect for a game by a company that I have chosen to enshrine in the same lofty ranks as Compile. Thunder Force was something of a technical tour de force for its platform. Although the X1 boasted a bit more CPU power and RAM than a basic MSX model of the era, it wasn't that much beefier. Nevertheless, Thunder Force took the form of a free-scrolling top-down shooter in which players ranged across an open landscape, scrolling the scenery in all directions as they sought out and destroyed enemy ground installations while avoiding incoming fire. It's a little choppy in motion, but nowhere near as janky or rough as you might expect given its age and the limitations of its platform. Thunder Force seems to have been reasonably successful by the standards of its era, and the following year, Technosoft published an expanded revision called Thunder Force Construction. Not quite a full sequel, this one feels like Yoshimura saw the level construction component of Loadrunner and said, "Wow, that's so cool," etc., etc. So yes, Thunder Force Construction included a custom stage builder feature. You know, like the one that Will Wright was eventually compelled to create based on his time working on Bungling Bay, and which eventually evolved into SimCity. What I'm saying here is that video games exist in conversation with one another, even if they don't always realize it. Thunder Force 2 builds on a fascinating little legacy in a largely forgotten corner of Japanese games history, one that feels both directly inspired by and predictive of some of the foundational works of both American and Japanese studios. Thunder Force 2 carries forward the top-down, free-scrolling combat of its predecessor, but it drops the construction feature in favor of an alternate mode, a forced horizontal shooter in the Darius vein, or the Golkov vein if we're going with Compile comparisons. Thunder Force 2 still weights heavily toward the primal top-down approach. About 75% of my playtime for this recording consisted of that mode, and the side-scrolling material feels more like the dessert that you only get to enjoy after you eat your top-down vegetables. Which isn't to say that the top-down material is bad, just that the horizontal phases feel a lot more structured and confident. Although Americans think of the Thunder Force series as a Sega-exclusive venture, surely reinforced by the fact that Sega eventually bought out the Technosoft catalog and republished the fourth Thunder Force as part of its Sega Ages line a few years back, Thunder Force 2 was actually built on the first game's Sharp connection. In Japan, Thunder Force 2 debuted on the Sharp X68000 home computer in June 1988. Funnily enough, that puts it about 6 months ahead of the legendary X68000 adaptation of Namco's Bosconian, an overhauled and upgraded port of the arcade game that very possibly inspired Thunder Force, featuring a soundtrack by Xevious Devote and mainstay Sega partner Yuzo Koshiro. Again, gaming is a very small world, is what I'm saying. I can't speak to the X68000 version of Thunder Force 2 from personal experience, but it seems to play and perform a whole lot like the familiar Genesis adaptation. After all, Sharp's computer had a fairly similar architecture to the Genesis, albeit with about 30% more CPU power and 8 times the RAM. The Genesis version feels more zoomed in, with the player ship appearing larger on the screen due to the relatively paltry pixel resolution of the Genesis. Mind you, the Genesis had the best resolution of any console at the time, 320 by 240 pixels, but the X68000 was a graphical beast that could display 1024 by 1024 pixels of resolution in certain modes. The original Sharp rendition also included transparency and parallax scrolling that the Genesis couldn't handle, and its backgrounds featured more detail. So the Genesis version had to be compromised. And you can certainly feel those cuts, even if you've never seen or played the source material. However, and I don't think I can stress this point enough, we are talking about a console game release by the standards of 1989 here. By that measure, Thunder Force 2 doesn't feel compromised or cut. It feels breathtaking in its speed and ambition. Its individual parts don't quite add up to a perfect whole, admittedly, but of everything to ship day one for Genesis, Thunder Force 2 is the one game that genuinely speaks to the idea of a next-generation 16-bit console as a genuine improvement over what had come before. It's not that the graphics are particularly jaw-dropping. Certainly they do look nicer than any shooter I can think of for NES, or Master System, or Atari whatever to this point. Even Compile's Power Strike. And the music is pretty awesome too. But frankly, I'd say that Space Harrier II and Altered Beast make for far more convincing Genesis technical showcases than Thunderblade 2. Now, the thing that makes Thunderblade 2 so compelling is its speed and fluidity. Whether in top-down or side-scrolling mode, the action in Thunderblade 2 always moves incredibly fast and features relentless combat balanced by feather-touch controls. Again, like a Compile shooter, the player's fighter-craft can collect a huge variety of weapons that instantly tilt the odds in your favor. But the game never feels friction-free or boring. Certain enemy types drop icon pods that add a new weapon to your arsenal, and you have the freedom to cycle through and swap between all the weapons you've collected at the press of a button. By default, you can alternate between a dual forward beam and a single fire weapon that shoots simultaneously forward and behind you. You can upgrade your basic arms, as well as pick up massively powerful alternate attack modes, like a spinning laser ring that fills the screen, a massive homing barrage, and a 5-directional spread. There's even a little drone that circles your ship to double your assault force while protecting you from incoming fire. However, while you may be tempted to simply lean on the biggest, most screen-filling attacks you can snag, the alt weapons come with a caveat. Many of the weapons can only take out aerial enemies, flying harmlessly above ground-based installations. Unfortunately, you can't advance past a top-down zone until you weed out all of the ground structures in a stage. So you do get a little of that Xevious flavor here, weighing combat factors differently between airborne and ground-based targets. Although you have a single fire button, and don't have to worry about precision bombing with an alternate button, you can't simply grab the most powerful gun in the game, which is the homing hunter beam, and assume that the game has simply become a fire-and-forget affair. The hunter won't target bases and pillboxes on the surface, so you need to cycle between weapons for maximum effect. At the same time, you have to be mindful not only of the aerial enemies and their projectiles, and sometimes their relentless pursuit craft, but also of elevated structures. In the first stage, the only scenery that poses a threat is the partition barriers that divide the area along orthogonal lines. You need to open these barriers by blasting their control stations in order to move between sections of an area, but the walls are pretty easy to avoid. In the second stage, however, you have to worry about platforms and what appear to be fuel tanks that sometimes obstruct your flight. And in the third stage, most of your playtime involves maneuvering around jagged outcroppings that fill the entire space. This makes for a pretty manic game, but unfortunately, the Genesis's resolution limitations really work against the concept. Because the action is zoomed in, and there's so much less pixel information available as you fly around on Genesis than on X68000, these sequences become much more challenging than I think the developers intended. Your ship moves incredibly quickly, and threats can appear from any direction at any time. So it becomes almost overwhelming. It doesn't help that the game doesn't provide you with an on-screen radar map or anything, like, Bosconian did, to help you orient yourself and keep a lock on the ground structures you need to destroy. This leads to a lot of aimless flying around to seek out missing structures while rapidly changing direction to avoid smashing into enemies and structures, at least until you've memorized the layout of stages through repeated play. Too much time spent in the top-down mode has a disadvantage. The tight viewing window and high-speed backgrounds that scroll in all directions can leave you with some serious motion sickness. I am not a person who has trouble with game visuals or spaces, but I actually couldn't finish a complete playthrough of Thunder Force 2 during my recording session because I ended up getting severely dizzy by the third stage. Still, I have to hand it to Technosoft. They really managed to showcase the visual scrolling capabilities of the Genesis. There's no way you could have had such speedy action that scrolled so smoothly in all directions on NES or Master System at this point. And you certainly wouldn't have enjoyed such free, fast movement while enjoying such layered parallax effects, or filled the screen with this many enemies and projectiles without suffering from compromising slowdown or flicker. Unlike the big, detailed graphics of other Genesis launch titles, which looked great but were ultimately superficial enhancements, the blazing action and explosive combat of Thunder Force 2 hint at what this level of improved technology could do to create console action experiences a step or two above the capabilities of 8-bit systems. Thunder Force 2 is rough, yes, and it doesn't appear to be as good as the X68000 original. I think Technosoft did realize that the more sedate, side-scrolling combat portions work better on Genesis than the top-down sequences do, because the next 4 entries in the series would consist entirely of horizontal shooting. That was probably the correct choice in terms of user experience, but it does seem a shame to jettison an interesting, albeit rough, gameplay mode rather than attempting to salvage it through sequel refinements. The side stages of Thunder Force 2 consist of a simple fight from left to right to take out a boss at the end. But these phases do retain the instant weapon swapping of the overhead levels, which gives them a different feel from something like Gradius or R-Type, where you have to commit to a single weapon setup at a time. All in all, Thunder Force 2 isn't the best game in the Genesis launch lineup. It's too messy and frustrating to claim that honor. But it is the most interesting game at launch, and the one that teases the most appealing future. Next time on Segaiden, and now for something really scary.